Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, dialectical behavior therapy skills for making a life worth living. I'm your host, Eric Nykamp, a therapist and clinical director at the Grand Rapids campus of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services, a mental health practice with campuses throughout the great state of Michigan. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, a podcast exploring the what, when, and how of using dialectical behavior therapy skills for making a life worth living. My name's Eric. I'm a DBT therapist and one of the clinical directors at Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about chain analysis, which for some of you listening, if you're doing DBT, you do this on a pretty regular basis. And for some of you, you're like, what is chain analysis? So we're going to get into all that. Joining me today is Dr. Valencia Agnew. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
And for those of you that don't know, she is the founder of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services. So it's pretty great that she's going to be on today with us. So let's start out talking about what is chain analysis.
So, Eric, it is describing a chain analysis is, to me, it's like it is exactly how it sounds.
Yeah.
It is, you think of a chain and there's links to a chain, and each link is connected to another link, but there's a start to the links of the chain and there's an end to a chain. And with chain analysis, we are looking at behaviors and doing an analysis about the behaviors, about the outcome of a situation, about a problematic behavior. And it doesn't even have to be a problematic behavior. It can be, a positive or rewarding behavior. Mm-hmm. But you look at the event and what it is that you want to explore, and you look at all of the links that are attached to it, that started it and got it to the end point. And often we have had clients, I'm sure you've had clients where they say things like, it just happened. Like, I don't know, it just happened.
Just happened.
And they think that life just happens to them, or decisions that they make were just a decision. And they not really realize that there were a link of events that led up to it. And so when they're able to look at those links on the chain and look at what were your thoughts, what were your feelings, what were your actions, what were your urges, what were the consequences and results, that they can then start to see, oh, it didn't all happen in one full swoop. I tend to be a person who feels and then acts on my feelings. I feel and I do. And sometimes my actions have seemed to be almost simultaneously happening as the feeling happened. And so it would be easy for me to say that, oh, the behavior just happened. But the behavior didn't just happen. I felt something first. Mm-hmm. And that's what the chain analysis does, is you get to look at every single link that led up to a behavior and identify what it is you want to do differently and how you can change those links. Like, you can put little interventions. So if you could think of it as you have this chain and it's not carved in stone, it may be difficult to break the links, but you can insert another link in there. And just by changing up a link, you can change the outcome to something that you want that's more desirous than it just happened to me and here we are.
Do you ever watch cooking videos on any social media platform?
I do. I like cooking videos. I like cooking shows.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the other day, this is when I'm thinking about chain analysis, I was watching all these different cooking videos and I thought, I want to make a cooking video for my kids of this certain dish that we make. My wife's Chinese and we do a lot of that cooking together. So I was like, I want to make this really complicated Chinese dish and record all the steps. Mm-hmm. So that because they can't spend time with me in the kitchen right now, then they can see it. And I was like, oh, I've watched all these videos of people doing that. Let me tell you, when you slow down the process of something that you do and think about what is every single step that I do, it's even more than just the directions on a recipe card. It's like thinking through, oh, I've got to get this out. Oh, this has to come back to room temperature. Then I need to cut it up, but I can't just cut it up anyway. I got to cut it up this specific way. And then when you mix it together, you're not just like throwing it in and seeing what happens. Like there's a way that you stir it, and this is how you notice when it's coming together. That's like chain analysis. Chain analysis is slowing yourself down and thinking through every single experience, thought, behavior in order from beginning to end. And if there are any mistakes in there, it's going to be in the record.
Right.
And you can figure, if you kind of imagine that first one is like the path that you got to where you got, which if it was a mistake, you got to this end where, oh man, I have some regret. Well, where would you make a second path? Like if you were heading down that road, where are the places where there could be forks in the road? And if you went down a different path or did a different thing, you might end up somewhere new.
Yes, you would get different results.
Yeah. Well, we started getting into it here, but when do you think that people would want to use chain analysis, or maybe even when do they use chain analysis in DBT therapy?
Often in DBT, a chain analysis is used for a target behavior that someone wants to change.
What's a target behavior?
A target behavior might be something like perhaps they use substances and they want to change that behavior.
I can see that.
Or perhaps they self-harm and they want to change that behavior. Or they maybe have suicidal thoughts and possibly have had attempts or frequently think about ways to attempt, and so they want to change that. It can be conflict that they have in relationships, that they find that they're pushing people away when they want to be closer. And as they're pushing people away, it's like, how do I keep doing this? Or why is it that, my friends and family don't like me, or something like that, that they're starting to think. And they don't realize that there are a set of behaviors or things that are happening that they do have some control over so that they can get a different outcome. So I love that it's that with a chain analysis, you can look at what are your patterns and think about what can you do differently. And again, DBT is not a cure-all. It doesn't mean that once you do a chain analysis, you're always going to get what you want. You may not get what you want, but you do get to have control over how you handle the outcome, how you handle your emotions, how you handle your behaviors, so that at the end of it, you get to have self-respect.
Yeah. I like that. When I sit down with people, sometimes we'll talk about there's the circle of things that I can control and the circle of things that I cannot control. And of the things that you can control, which isn't everything, what choices are you making with that so that you can, in some ways, increase the likelihood of getting what you want, even though you know it's not possible to control everything to get what you want? How could you stack the deck? How can you better the odds of getting what you want based on just the things that you can control?
Right. I call it setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So telling those stories in therapy or writing it down somehow or making diagrams on paper, that's when someone would use it in session, what they would do. Yeah.
Yes, I love writing it down, mostly because I'm visual, but I think it is just an additional way of learning versus just talking about it. for clients to write it down and be able to look at it, and so that they have something tangible that they can take with them outside of the session and look at it and think about it and apply it, and to see how is this pattern of behavior happening in other situations, because chances are that pattern of behavior is happening in more than one situation.
Absolutely. And I tell you what, when I've had people that do these in session, it doesn't take too many times of doing it before people start noticing that, oh, we do this same thing every session. And if I'm talking about the same thing or something that's very similar each week, and just having to say it out loud, to write it down, they see the pattern. And when they start heading into that pattern, sort of like driving into a very familiar neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you find that you don't have to think about where to turn when you're driving home. If you're heading home, except that the place you're heading is the place you don't want to be,
Right.
the light bulb goes on because you've done chain analysis for several weeks about the same thing. You're like, oh my goodness, I've literally written down what happens when I do these things, and I'm halfway there. What am I going to do different to get out of it?
Right.
And they turn. And then the first time they do it, they are so proud of themselves. They're like, Eric, you'll never believe what happened. I was starting
Mm-hmm.
to do the thing, and then I noticed I'm starting to do the thing, and I didn't do the thing.
Yes. Yes. When you realize you didn't do the thing, and there's hope for mastering that skill, and that is, it's a reward by itself, because then they get to look at that chain, and instead of seeing the chain end with consequences, it could end with rewards.
Well, I know that you have some really creative ways that you've done chain analysis with clients before. Do you mind sharing some of those ways?
Sure. With children, my favorite way of doing it is by cutting strips of paper and having them create a chain, just a long chain. And we start out with, just talking about what was the behavior, and maybe it was time for school, and they didn't want to go to school, they didn't want to get out of bed, and they're throwing a tantrum, and there's consequences with that, and maybe they're aware enough to know to say, I don't want to have the same fight every morning, or I want to be able to go to school, but I'm scared, or whatever the reason might be. And so we can back that chain up and look at the whole chain of events that leads to the not wanting to get out of bed in the morning. And like prompting event, it might be um, going all the way back to, I did not go to bed on time last night. So what was that? Maybe is I can't think of the right word, but the before the prompting event,
Oh,
the
the vulnerability.
the vulnerability factor of being tired, of not getting enough sleep, of it might be a vulnerability factor of, I'm already anxious about school, feeling like maybe I don't have a lot of friends, that like there's things that make you vulnerable. If they have diagnosed depression or anxiety, a vulnerability factor could be it's a new school or new people. It could be that there's a test coming up that day, like a lot of vulnerability factors. And then the prompting event happens. Mom says, go to bed. Maybe you have a kid who's pretty compliant and will go to bed, but they don't actually go to sleep. They're sitting there. They've figured out how to fumble around with everything. They're playing with the cat. They're singing songs to themselves. They got tiny little flashlight under the cover, like maybe. And then there's also the kid that might be more out there with the behaviors, and so they're not going to bed and they're refusing to go. And so they have like their prompting event of mom said go to bed, dad said go to bed. Then the next chain might be I'll do like, let's do blue for feelings and red for thoughts and green for actions and yellow for urges. So you pick a different color for each one of those so that each way through the chain, whenever you get to a feeling, then you're going to use the blue for that's your feeling. And then the next thing is like, and after you've done your feelings, what did you think? Because what you feel and what you think are two different things. So what were your thoughts? And I think actually I start with thoughts first. What did you think? Then what did you feel? And then what were your urges? Just because I have an urge doesn't mean I acted on it. So what are your urges? And then what are your actions? And then what were the consequences result? And so consequence could be I was tired when I woke up this morning for school. I really didn't want to go, or I had worked myself up into more anxiety than what I had at the very beginning. Consequences now, mom and dad are upset and they're yelling at me. Consequences, I'm late for school. So that's what I do with children. I like with adults, if I can have the big whiteboard in the conference room, I love using that. And especially if it's parents with children or spouses doing a simultaneous chain so that they can both do their chain on the board and see each other's what's happening in real time with what that person was, what their feelings and thoughts and urges and actions, and to see how that chain goes. And even though I said there's an end to a chain, in some instances there's not really an end. It just may be the start of a new chain, depending on what the consequences or results were. How, if they do a repair, because it's important to do a repair so that that chain doesn't just keep going. Yeah. And then there's other things like with the chains. I really love having clients, when they identify what their feelings are, to also identify what was the level of intensity with that feeling.
Yep.
Because maybe you only felt it at a 1, but maybe you felt it at a 10. And if you were feeling it at a 10, how did that impact thoughts? And did actions, urges go into actions because you were feeling it so intensely? Those type of things with the chains, and giving them as homework. I like giving it as homework to come back with interventions. Like, what could you have put in this chain? And I'll use an example of it as a train. And if we can catch the train before it leaves the station, there's a chance to change it, to change the course, to stop the train. But there is a point of no return. If you don't catch it before a certain point, you can just forget it, because your next course of action is going to be repairs because it's now too late. You can catch it at vulnerability factors. If you know that you need to take your meds, because that sets you up for success. If you know it's been a long day, you're tired, get some sleep. If you know you haven't eaten well, taken care of yourself, eat something. Like, do all of the things to set you up for success. And then, all the skills that we'll be talking about later, or that you will be talking about later, are all interventions that can be put in the chain to help someone. It might be using mindfulness, because if you can be mindful of your feelings and really be aware right there, that could be all you need to keep you from the action urge.
Mm-hmm.
Or it may be that you need to reach out for help and call the coaching line or something different. But the more aware you are, the more you can put in interventions that can keep the train from leaving the station. Because once it's taken off, there's just no chance of catching it.
Yeah. I know sometimes when I do chains with people, I do them very similarly. And I didn't know that you did all those different things. So I was kind of smiling because I'm like, oh, that's very, very similar to what I do sometimes. I actually use colored cards to do a very similar thing and like make a
Hmm.
path on the floor,
Hmm.
tabletop with people, and then they can kind of imagine paths and things like that. I like to point out to people that sometimes the triggering event, we a lot of times think of them as like situations, but a trigger can also be a thought where like you could just be sitting all alone
Right.
by yourself. And there you go, thinking this self critical thought.
Hmm.
And that self critical thought could get that train to leave the station right there. No situation, just you sitting alone with your thoughts.
Right.
And when we get to like, well, what did you do that I like to ask people to think about two words that start with the letter R when they think about the consequences. And then we go to the third R, which is repairs. But one of them is like, what was the reward? Because sometimes the reason we keep doing these patterns of behavior is that
There's a
something,
payoff.
there's a payoff. And if you can understand it, you can have compassion for yourself. Like, oh, my behavior makes sense. It's not just me doing this crazy thing or whatever, self deprecating language you have. It actually makes sense. The payoff a lot of times is short term. And the long term consequences is where people have that second R word, which is regret. So, what's the rewards and what are the regrets? And if they can identify both of those, it's a little easier to motivate yourself to say, well, I really want to avoid those regrets. And that allows some folks to be able to think through, oh, too often I make the choice to have this short term reward. But what I
Right.
really want to do in the long term is avoid regret. So I need to do this different thing because I don't want to have to do the repairs. What have you found that gets in the way of people wanting to do chain analyses?
I think in DBT in particular, it tends to be that they think of it as a punishment
Mm-hmm.
because a behavior has happened that they want, that they're ashamed of or that they wish were different. And so sometimes they think of it as a punishment. So that's one of the things that gets in the way of it.
Yeah,
Another thing is that it is tedious.
it is.
And what I like to tell people is that you didn't start this pattern overnight. The pattern of behavior that you have, you probably have been learning it, building it, doing it for a while. So it's going to take some effort to change that behavior. It's going to take some time. And that means you now have to look at it and you there may be pieces of it that you are missing, and doing a chain helps you to just
Yeah,
slow it down so that you can see it and then you can change it. But the tediousness of it, because they'll want to come in and tell you, hey, here's what happened, blah, 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 and rattle it off rather quickly of here's what happened. And gosh, I'm sorry, I did that again,
yep.
and then not really want to delve into every single step of how did you get here.
I, I think a lot of people have, especially if they've had therapy before, and a lot of kinds of therapy, it is where you walk in the door and you start telling your therapist all the awful things, kind of
Mhm.
with this belief that if I can just get it off my chest, that makes it better. And if that hasn't worked for you, doing this new thing, which is like, in some ways, like slowing it down, or it's like almost like reading a comic book frame by frame.
Mhm.
And kind of looking at each frame and being like, okay, now when did things take that turn towards regret? That slowing down process does, people sometimes really do want to resist that because it feels so unfamiliar. It's not what we usually do when we sit down and talk with friends. But that analysis piece is about getting insight. And if what you want to
Yes.
pay for in therapy is, I want to walk away with insight so I don't keep doing the same thing that I hate,
Mhm.
well, then that insight, you need this insight tool, which is very different from just a regular storytelling form of therapy.
And it's so powerful when you gain that insight and then you get to start thinking about, wow, what would have happened if I had been mindful right here? Ooh, I maybe could have made this choice. Like you get to start seeing the possibilities of choices, the possibility of options.
Yes. Well, I think you hit the nail right on the head in terms of like, well, these are the things that make our life worth living. Is seeing that we have some agency, we have some options, can imagine a hopeful future, imagining a future that you're making different choices than the ones you've always made. Can you think of any other reasons that or ways that using this skill helps us make a life worth living?
I think just what you said, to reiterate what you said, having the agency. And to me, there is something really very powerful about having a choice and knowing that that choice is mine,
Mhm.
that I get to make that decision for myself, regardless of what the situation is, whether it's something that happened to me or because of myself, that I still get to decide. And I can think of my own times when I not it's not very often, I'm be really transparent. It's not really very often that I get angry. I don't tend to really get angry. And I think that's because I tend to know what my primary emotion is before it quickly can change to anger. And I can think of a time when I was so upset, I was just irritated, and I just like blurted out, my thoughts on a matter, and then afterwards it was just like, oh my gosh, what in the world just happened? Because it's so out of the norm. And thankfully that was a time where it's like I can sit and look at all of the behaviors, each little step, even though it seemed to have happened in an instant, it felt instantaneous. But it was like, oh my gosh, I see all of the little things that was leading up to that. And I see the point where it was like, train has left the station, this button was pushed, and I had all kinds of feelings and all kinds of thoughts, and feelings do. And and that was, looking at that analysis was a pivotal point for me, in which I decided I never wanted to react that way again. And it made me be so much more self aware of what could even trigger me, because I wanted to know what in the world could even trigger me to feel that level of anger. Obviously, you hurt my kids, that could, but beyond that kind of a thing, it's like, what could trigger me that way? And so I'm so much more self-aware, which means now I take care of myself differently so that I can set myself up for success. And that's what we're talking about with living a life worth living. You get to do more than exist, more than survive. You get to thrive.
Mm.
And this is a skill. This is something that can help you thrive.
Yeah. Well, this was a really good conversation. I've really enjoyed talking about this with you. I feel like we could probably talk about it a lot longer if we really wanted to.
We could.
But we'll end right here. And, one thing I'd like to leave everybody with is, I hope that this episode helps you understand a little bit more about chain analysis, or at least got you hungry for it, for maybe wanting to do this in therapy. It can take a lifetime to master any skill, and with practice, it will get progressively easier over time. I hope you learn that if you do chain analysis. We hope that all of you continue doing, being, and thinking in wise ways on your way to making a life worth living. It's good to talk with you. See you next time. Thanks for listening. Doing, Being, Thinking is an educational podcast about dialectical behavior therapy and is not intended as a substitute for therapy. This is a podcast outreach of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services, offering both in-person and telehealth therapy to children, teens, and adults throughout Michigan. If you are a Michigan resident and want to get started with therapy, including DBT, children's DBT, or other evidence-based therapies, please contact us at 616-719-0194 or find us on the web at www.adolescentfamilybhs.com.